I want to follow up on one of the comments Tom made, because I think it's an extraordinarily powerful perspective, and that is that you have wide adoption of a lot of management system standards around the world. And what you realize is that, I mean, he touched on this, is a fair portion of the language in each of these management systems, mostly the language that talks about organization and data and risk and review, things like that, is common. I mean, it's in the world of ISO standards, they call it the blue text. And that blue text is common across all the management system standards. So if we could find somebody, an asset intensive organization that's already been certified, for example, to ISO 9001, then it would be very little additional work for them to gain ISO 55001 certification, should they choose to. So just to reinforce the point Tom made, and that is that for asset management purposes, we ought to try to build on the management system standard foundation that's already out there. And we're talking in terms of reported organizations that are certified to those standards. I think 9001, it's like over 1 million, or at least it's 9001 and 14,001 together is about 1.3 million organizations certified to those standards around the world, which is enormous. So I would suggest that. The other thing, and I want to reinforce the point about politics and the ability to make good infrastructure, or I should say, the impact of politics of preventing the making of good decisions on infrastructure investments. In order, when this country was doing its best in terms of building like the interstate system and other big national projects, we had a political consensus about what was needed in the country. We needed electricity, we needed, good water, we needed a good, effective transportation network. And so you could get people from both sides of the aisle coming together and saying, okay, we might differ in some of the specifics, but we agree with the goal. We need to do something as a nation to solve this problem. We seem not to be at that stage anymore. I mean, one of the jokes in Washington, D.C. is how often there's been an infrastructure week. I mean, infrastructure week is announced, time passes, nothing happens. Nothing's even actually discussed about it. So that's one point. The other point is that when we talk, most of the conversation about infrastructure investments in this country is how much money can we find for new infrastructure. The beauty of ISO 55000 and other, good asset management techniques is that you make better decisions about the money that you're currently spending, and we're spending a bunch. So just the ability to get more benefit, get more value from the money we're already spending ought to be front and center in people's minds as they think about asset management in their organizations.
Yeah, so, I would say that the last point is one that deserves some real attention. At the municipal level, whether it's state or local, I have a whole file folder full of articles from newspapers and other blogs and so forth about utility managers, whether they're transit managers or water managers or whatever, coming out asking for rate increases and essentially being abandoned by the local politicians. The mayor or the city council will trot the manager out and then leave that poor manager hanging to dry because they won't take a stand on the need to spend money for assets. They're going to hide in the weeds and criticize additional spending and saying they're not for any more taxes, they're not for any more expenditure, but with no real proposal as to how we're going to manage to keep this infrastructure intact without it. I just look at the denial around lead water pipes, which seems to me a pretty straightforward issue. They're not a good idea, but actually getting the money to fix them, we're putting our heads in the sand, and that would be one of the clearest issues to me. I mean, there's no excuse for that one. So. The other part of it is when you talk about managing infrastructure, there are a number of things that we call non-asset solutions. So there are some water utilities in drought-stricken areas in the US and all around the world that are spending up to a third of their budget on water conservation. And the public relations, the management, all of the infrastructure, that's an organizational infrastructure that goes into water conservation, but it's real and it's as effective as putting in another pipe in many cases. So we need to think that there are non-asset solutions in many cases, which are solutions, and they are in many cases as troublesome and as expensive as asset solutions, but they're an alternative and they need to be put in there.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we need to discuss in the promotion in the future of asset management is not just a common taxonomy, which you mentioned before, Jack, but a common language to describe the assets and what they do. My own industry that I work in is the electric power industry. So when you mention WAPA, the Western Area Power Administration, it's an area I've visited, it's an area I've worked with, and gone out and tested power transformers for them. So if I mention the word power transformers, people will think, well, I've got power coming out the wall, I've got a transformer between the wall and my PC, it's a little box about yay big, and I've got a power transformer. No, you haven't. A power transformer is well defined in the industry. It's defined by the Institution of Electrical and Electronic Engineers in the US and by the International Electrical Commission around the world. And it does provide a common language. And we have to start seeing the industry that we are in as having a means to talk to each other in a common format. So when someone mentions water pipes, we know exactly what they mean and what they're talking about. Is it the same water pipe serving a building as it serves coming out of the Hoover Dam, for example? There is a use of language, there is a use of taxonomy, which needs to be addressed and formalized so that we can then all talk about things in exactly the same way. It is very difficult. In my own industry, there's a thing called a common information model, allows utilities to share information. It's not complete. It doesn't include, or it did not include until recently, condition monitoring information. It had temperatures, but it wasn't considered to be a condition value. So as we look to the future, we need to understand that we have to move away from the Tower of Babel. What we need is a common Esperanto type language, which everyone can understand and has common meaning, and then we can understand common value.
Great point, Tony.
The oil and gas industry, there is an ISO standard taxonomy defined to oil and gas. And the reason that was developed was that for the very largest pieces of equipment in oil and gas, the undersea compressors and so forth, there aren't enough ends in any one company to do the required analytics. So in order to do what they need to do to manage that equipment, they need to share data. And the first step in sharing data was to develop a common taxonomy.
And you have to be careful, Tom, because when companies share data, they're also then exposing their weaknesses, because what you're interested in is repair cycles and failure modes. And if things are failing, that indicates that your company may not be doing as well as it should. And so the company I work for, Doble, we have clients of every major utility in North America, and a significant number will share their failure mode data, their power transformers, their breakers, their cables, etc. And what we find is that there are very, very different failure rates for very, very similar assets because of the operational capabilities of the organization. People don't necessarily want that to be public, so they have a reticence about sharing data.
Sure.
Do any of the industry associations offer opportunities or have any kind of membership requirements dealing with data sharing or common taxonomies?
So
Quite a number do.
Please go ahead.
No?
I would say not enough. And I would say that as Tony just mentioned, there is not enough of that, and the data models are not rigorous enough. We're getting there. But as soon as you get into this, you realize the devil's in the details. And you better iron out those details. And they take a lot of commitment to get real data and that's truly shared.
Well, going back to the taxonomy, we developed within NALS Part 1, we developed a taxonomy at a very high level. And Jim Dieter has actually written an ASTM standard that I think is somewhere in the internal review process, which would formalize that taxonomy. So there's certainly an interest in trying to do that. And I hope that, that we'll be able to get that through.
The important thing is to share information about, coming back to the aging infrastructure, what actually matters in terms of what is aging. What do we need to keep track of? What do we need to look at? What data is going to tell us how things are performing? So that condition analysis is not a simple process. It's not necessarily linear, it's not uniform. And the same assets in two locations may have very different life expectancies, partly because of the ambient, but also because of the way they're treated. Imagine going to a large parking lot and someone says, you can take home any car you like, just pick the one you want. You're going to have a very good idea which ones are reliable, which ones are less reliable. You're going to have a very good idea about the value of the individual units for what you want a car for. What other information would you be interested in? Sharing that type of a question means that people start to look at what data they have. So I want to know who's driven it for the last 10 years. I had what I used to call an F3, a fine Ford Focus. I kept it for 10 years. I gave it to someone else. 6 months later, they need a new one. There's nothing wrong after 10 years, and 6 months later, it's a wreck. So how people use things are very important to the asset lifecycle.
So I'm going back to the point that y'all discussed earlier about people just not being sufficiently motivated to solve a lot of these problems. And one of the things that I remember from looking into the history of asset management is that some of the, particularly in the UK, some of the things that got like the Institute for Asset Management created and some of the early work on standards, past 55, for example, was a response to a disaster. And in this case, that North Sea oil rig, disaster that spilled all kinds. It's like their version of Deepwater Horizon. And I know in other countries, disasters have been a big impetus to taking action to get their acts together and to put in place, not only put in place standards, but also make investments to make sure these things don't happen again. We haven't had, we have no shortage of accidents and asset-related disasters in this country. Deepwater Horizon example, Exxon Valdez is another, that bridge over the Mississippi in Minneapolis. I mean, we've got PG&E with the San Bruno, fires from their gas system, which led them to go on and get certified to pass 55 and ISO 55001. But why don't we have more outrage at the disasters we have? Flint water, you mentioned. I mean, why didn't that lead to something really remarkable and powerful?
I'll let Tom address that one.
I don't know the answer. It's one of the ways that the U.S. is remarkable in a bad way.
Well, we have specializations in disaster communications. I mean, we have very, very, very large, powerful, and expensive consulting firms that get called in to explain why that disaster wasn't really our fault and how we're going to be better next time and so forth. So I think the disasters can spur some things and maybe consolidate activities that are already underway. But I see that opportunity is a much more powerful motivator. When you look at what's going on in industry right now, the opportunities for integrating design, operations, and management, the efficiencies that are involved in that, the quality control that's available, the promise to the customer that's available, those things are all motivators that I think are more powerful long-term than papering over a disaster. One of the things I think is critical, I had a conversation recently with a company that's made some real serious strides in its service to its customers through analytics, which support the assets, which enable them to understand exactly what they're promising to the customers in terms of service. And my counsel, and I think for anyone listening, is you need the marketing group involved in that. Because as soon as that company got their salespeople involved in promising asset management results to customers, asset management became baked into the company. You can say what you want about top leadership. You can say what you want about finance, but get the sales and marketing people involved and to understand that asset management allows you to make promises that not only sound good, but those are promises you can keep. And they've become my favorite target when you put an asset management team together. I think if you don't have marketing involved, you're missing a major piece of the puzzle, and you're missing the continuity that's required for the organization.
I think
great idea.
I think after any kind of a disaster, there's a period of time where things can happen, where you can motivate people to get things done.
Yeah.
But the energy dissipates very quickly. And after that, then you've got to wait for the next one.
I'm fascinated by about the data. Do you think any of the political bodies, and I'm talking not partisan political, but like Congress or even local regulatory agencies, would have any appetite for actually requiring, from a transparency perspective, requiring organizations to post certain statistics, certain data about, whether it's water quality, whether it's, reliability of the electrical system, do you think that would be a path that might actually help improve things if we could require some of this transparency?
Well, for the electric supply industry, those statistics are already there in terms of what's called the system average interruption frequency and the system average number of customers interrupted, the whole range of KPIs which are produced. And of course, they're the things that get managed. How you get to a good KPI is pretty much irrelevant. And the question is, did you hit your target? Yes, then we don't fine you. I think for the company I work for, National Grid, 2009 was the first time in its several jurisdictions in the US that we didn't get fined in all of those jurisdictions, or in any of those jurisdictions, sorry. So that was a banner year, and you could say it was significantly affected by the ice storm of 2008. So.
Guys, this has been a great discussion. With the remaining 5 minutes, would you be willing to field a few questions? We have some.
As many as you like.
Cecilia has a question. She agrees that the common language is critical, but when you say inertia, does that also include lack of consciousness about the need to manage the assets actively and proactively? How and how much is the issue brought to the forefront of discussions in places where thought leaders, owners, and operators may be?
I think I was the one who introduced the word inertia, so I would say yes. If you're not aware of an issue, it's very difficult to address anything. And if you're choosing not to be aware, it makes it doubly difficult.
I would absolutely, and when we talk about, Tony and I, when we're talking about common language and data sharing, we're talking about a level of detail which goes far beyond the KPIs. In order for this stuff to be truly useful in management, it must be reliable and rigorous. I had a graduate student working for a major brewing company where the company spent 5 years and well over $5 million to develop a common taxonomy and common language for the equipment in its brewing lines. And that was the first step in controlling the assets. And they've taken a lot of other steps. But the issue is complex, it's demanding, and there has to be motivation to be willing to do this. It's not common language at the cocktail party level. It's common language at a business process level that is awfully difficult to develop, and there has to be more. There has to be motivation, and I think the motivation comes in from the customer, understanding what the customer wants and understanding how to serve that customer.
Awesome. There was another Marty Rowland had a comment worth addressing. Throughout the world, infrastructure is paid for by land value taxation. Witness transit in Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Singapore, where no subsidy is needed for operations and capital. The same approach should be used for every type of asset and asset management system. You guys want to comment on that?
Let Tom go first on that one.
You got to throw that one at me too, huh? You know, there's certainly plenty of comments about land value taxation being regressive in some cases and unfair. Well, you know, there's a reason we went towards more user fees. And once we discovered user fees, then that dam broke, and they're everywhere. If I look at my utility bill, half of what I pay for electricity is user fees of various sorts. Well over half of my water bill is user fees. It's not based on the usage. It's based on fees for, I don't know, we've thrown stormwater, we've thrown reforestation, we've thrown fire protection, we've thrown everything into the water utility because they have the ability to collect revenue. So I you know, you can throw it into land value, but I think you have to be pretty careful about that. I mean, it may be in some cases that you want to put it into the general tax base instead.
Tony, you want to finish up with the last minute or so?
Yep, sure. I would go refer to a comment from Marty Rowland, I believe it is, who said if Beverly Hills water came out brown, something would have been done. Whereas in Flint, it didn't happen anywhere near so quickly. The thing I would come back to in the discussion we've had so far, we've used the word asset, we've used the word asset management. And what we have is those words being used to reflect what I would call commodity items. People are seemingly understanding the word asset. People know what power transformers are. We know what water pipes are. We know various things. And I would recommend everyone become aware of a thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where just because we understand a little bit of the language doesn't mean we understand the thing itself. Just because we've seen entries in a spreadsheet doesn't mean we understand what those things are doing and capable of. And what we need is to have a little bit more understanding, and we need people who know what's actually going on with the assets themselves.